All right, well, it is 10:02, and I think it is a good time to get going because I know we have a lot of material to cover. So first of all, thank you to Simit for helping yet again to organize this Zoom session, and glad everyone could join us. We are here for the Agriculture and Rural Development Working Group of the Scaling Up Community of Practice. The conversation today is going to be around "It's the Economy, Stupid." Harks back to the 90s there. How sustained scale for agriculture programs must be rooted in lived economic experience. So today's speakers are Kate Fehlenberg and Colin Christensen. Kate will be talking about what's the secret sauce to scaling success, lessons from digital agriculture. And Colin will be talking about proving the value of climate adaptation to smallholders. Kate is an international development professional with over 20 years of experience across a dozen countries. She has designed, managed, scaled, and evaluated both small and multi-million-dollar programs in public health, agriculture, and gender. She's done systematic assessments of new technologies and strengthening local systems for MSI, USAID, and the CGIAR. Kate has practiced in scaling sustainable solutions. In her last overseas assignment, Kate managed $15 million in U.S. food security project across 6 countries in Africa and helped to establish the Sea to Shore Alliance, a public-private coalition to digitize commercial value chains in Africa. Kate has a MPH in Population and Family Health and Complex Emergencies from Columbia University, a master's in Civil Engineering from Georgia Tech, and a bachelor's in Environmental Science from Sanford University. She served in the Peace Corps in Nepal. Colin has spent his career with organizations committed to innovative, impact-focused approaches to international development. He served as the Kenya Country Director for Innovations for the Poverty Action Lab, affiliated with MIT. And he ran government affairs for Bridge International Academies in Nairobi, a social enterprise that runs low-cost private schools. From 2015 to 2019, he led Government Relations Department One Acre Fund based out of Kigali, ensuring close partnership with the governments where One Acre Fund works. Since then, he's been based in Washington, D.C. as One Acre Fund's Global Policy Director, tasked with helping to ensure that the pressing needs of Africa's smallholder farmers are addressed comprehensively in policy and funding conversations outside the continent. So with that, I want to ask everybody to hold off on their questions. If you do have questions, though, you can enter them in the chat. Please feel free to do so. And we will start with Kate and her presentation, after which we will hopefully seamlessly move right into Colin's. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to cut off my video here to save some bandwidth. Appreciate this. Let's see if we can get this up and going. All right. Can everyone see that? Okay. I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, before I start very quickly, what I'm presenting today are key findings and lessons from an assessment I did for the USAID DIV program. But this report is not yet published, and all of the findings and recommendations, they're still in the process of finalizing that. So what I'm going to be presenting is what I, as an analyst, found, but these are not yet endorsed by USAID or anyone else, really. So disclaimer. Number 2, I'm going to be going pretty fast. There's a lot to unpack and we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try to focus on a few of the key messages that link to the topic. But there's a whole framework that was developed as well that could be gone into in another session. So hang tight while we're going fast. I also like to, when I was working on this with Colin, I almost called this presentation the Mythbusters. During this assessment, which was one of the most enjoyable assessments I've done in my career, I was given a bit of a free hand on how to look for scaling success, and had a really good time being able to kind of follow the data where it led. And a lot of common assumptions and myths were contradicted in the findings, so I look forward to getting into those. I will not be able to get into specific case studies just for time's sake, but One Acre Fund will be going into depth into their experience. So that's how we're going to do this, and here we go. So when I was charged to do this, what the purpose of the analysis, I really took this off of Michael Kremer, who co-founded the DIV program. Some instruction that he gave. He had done a couple of look-back reports on the DIV program, but the DIV program itself had not yet had, after 10 years, a portfolio review or any kind of comprehensive evaluation. I'm not sure how they got away with that, but they told me it's because they usually have enough data to pass muster. But this was different. This was a post facto, but we were trying to elucidate factors of scaling success to be used beforehand when selecting grants and when doing program management and support. So I took a page out of Michael Kremer's book where he says, if you look post facto, it's hindsight is 20/20. Anything that a successful team or innovation did, you'll call that success, and then vice versa, when that may not be true. But a tougher approach is to look at what succeeded and the factors associated with that. So that was the lens that I put on this. And I'm stealing a lot from you, Larry. You're going to see that throughout the presentation, but linking to the scaling principles. And I'll give credit where credit's due. I cut my teeth on scaling with Larry and MSI years ago. So you'll see a lot of that here as well. But it is still true, despite the fact that scaling has gotten a lot more currency lately, that few research projects are analyzed for their scalability or managed to maximize the likelihood of their scalability. So those were my two main charges as I took on this analysis. The questions I was meant to answer were, to what extent were the innovations successful in achieving impact, which of course has to be defined, but this was kind of a, where are they now? I was looking back at the digital agriculture innovations grants across the whole 10 years of DIV's history. So where are they now? They wanted to know. What were the salient elements that enabled or hindered success? That was the foundation of this whole assessment. So they kind of wanted to know what was the secret sauce that separated those that made it to scale and sustained there and those that did not. And then how can we integrate these findings into programming? So recommendations. So very quickly, the sample was 12 digital agricultural innovation grants. Again, it was over 10 years. There was a mix of stage 1 and stage 2, no stage 3s. And there was an even mix of grants that were funded for operations and those that were funded to generate evidence. Evidence, of course, being a pillar of the DIV program. There was also about an even split between innovations that were process innovations and those that were services. And they spanned, again, over a decade. So there was quite a mix. All right, the framework I'm going to go through very quickly just to give you a background. We had to define our terms. So success, well, how to define success? It wasn't just by a number, but in this analysis, we decided if the core model was still available. Now this is in 2021 when we looked back. Is that core model that was funded still available to a substantial number of target users? Now, substantial is very subjective. We can talk about all that all day, but we concluded that if we could find it as evaluators, either online or through key informant interviews and confirm that it was available on the market, that was considered substantial. Core model, Larry will find this familiar. Many innovations as they scale have to strip down and drop things to be able to scale. So we had to define what was the core model. There were a couple of cases where when we looked for what was funded, we found things that were similar, but we could not confirm if that was actually what was funded or not. The business name had changed. We couldn't contact the original grantees. We couldn't contact any key informants. It had changed quite a bit. So the effectiveness and the uniqueness, but this gets to the core model. We define that as what makes it effective and then what makes it unique. So as you scale, whatever iterations you do, you have to maintain fidelity to that core model. Scale, we define that as measurable impacts on the problem it was designed to address. So scale is often a moving target. It's not one number. Everyone can appreciate that it's a bit of a tipping point, and it differs by sector and by innovation. So in this assessment, we considered it to reach a certain level, a significant level of scale if it had measurable impacts on the problem it was designed to address. So looking at reports and looking at their current numbers vis-a-vis their targets, whether it was number of farmers reached or number of users uptaking the innovation or whatever their targets were, if they reached kind of measurable numbers there. Sustainability, also a very fungible term. We define that as long-term adoption by target users and essential value chain stakeholders. I'm going to emphasize throughout this that value chain stakeholders were just as critical as users, and there's often too much of an emphasis only on the users. But an innovation cannot be sustained if those essential members along the value chain who provide it, distribute it, have a key role in it, also don't adopt it over time. Partners, we looked at them through the lens of their role. So their role on the scale journey. We did mirror a bit of the role around ownership in expansion, replication, and collaboration. But we looked at those three approaches as the kind of business model you would have at scale. Will it be an expanded, replicated, or collaborative partnership? But we also looked at the roles during the scaling process. So beyond the responsibility for innovation, effectiveness, and quality, we looked at essential stakeholders, meaning those that you cannot scale without. It's more than the innovators and investors. And then we broke down a lot of subtypes. We found that a lot of scale strategies only talked about users and then investors. But if you broke down the different types of partners, that was a really critical key to making this work. Larry, you'll recognize that. I took that out for the scale model. All right, again, quickly through the framework elements. We had 6 elements to this framework. So we thought, let's look at this from 6 different points. We had the scaling strategy, which holds the pathway, the approach, partnership models, and the stakeholder engagement strategy. We considered that all to be parts of the scaling strategy. So we took those apart and analyzed those. We looked at the model, the whole model. So whether it was a technology or a behavior change, its functions, the benefits it had, the whole thing. We looked through the strategies, and we talked to grantees to really get the core model and nail that down so that we could see if that was still there over time. And the core model, I'll just say a word here, elements of the model also include not just the technology, but things like the user capacities it requires. So things like, does it require that someone speak English? Does it require a smartphone? Does it require that somebody can legally own land? This is part of the model. Changeover costs for providers, that's part of the model. If it costs a provider or a tractor seller a certain amount of money to get supplies from a new place or a new import tax, that's part of your model. That's what you're asking people to take on. Availability of the parts. So we really kind of broke down that these are the things that may help or hinder your scaling journey. Evidence, of course, this was the bedrock of a lot of this. In this assessment, we did not look at evidence for the mathematical rigor of the analysis. And there were 7 RCTs here out of the 12 grantees. We focused on evidence utility. Was all this data that was generated, all the money that was spent on this, was it used? And was it used to propel the innovation on its scaling journey? So we were trying to help DIV figure out, because it invests so much money in research and evidence generation, how to make sure that that evidence is useful and then it is used to propel the innovation along its journey. So this is about evidence for decision-making. So we looked at the types of evidence, who generated it, which turned out to matter, and then utilization, what made it to be utilized and not. Partnerships was the 4th element. Again, we defined partners by their roles. We had different kinds of categories if they were essential, supporting, inconsequential, or barriers. Those are kind of obvious. The key to partnerships in terms of engagement was enablers and incentives. This is going to be another key theme throughout. Now, that's not new to anybody who's talked about scale, but it really hammered home as we did this analysis on the ones that succeeded and the ones that did not. For each key stakeholder, from your users to your investors, to your distributors, identifying and then operationalizing enablers and incentives was critical. And then I wanted to tag a big part of it that came out, a theme throughout, was understanding the complex decision-making of farmers, or in any case, users, and the trade-offs they have to make when deciding for uptake was very much underestimated and very essential. So a lot of research on market research and user demand was found as a gap in most cases and as a critical element of success in the ones that had it. Financial viability. So again, when scaling, a big question is always, how long do we have to support this before it takes off? And one of the myths we wanted to bust was the Silicon Valley myth of invent something really cool, an investor will come in and give you millions of dollars and scale it for you. That doesn't work, especially in development. So financial viability was not a static thing. It was more of a condition that had to be met for all stakeholders, including the scaling team, the users, your scaling partners, and investors. So the upshot of viability, we define that as the ability during the scaling process for the team to cover their costs reliably, agnostic of the source. Cost effectiveness and profit potential were essential elements of viability for providers and other partners. And for users, financial accessibility and viability were also key. Last, we had contextual elements, and that was anything that's outside the control of the scaling team, basically. These are inherent, and this was the kind of things that we looked at. Okay. So where do all these framework elements fit in to our scaling principles? They fit in pretty closely. So I looked at these and they aligned pretty well to the framework that this scaling up community practice has already developed. Evidence, of course, being the heart of it. So we have all of the principles except number 7, but there was a nice kind of alignment there. So key findings. So what's the secret recipe? How am I doing on time?
About 2 minutes, Kate.
I have 2 minutes left.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay, let's hit it. Okay, there's principle number 7 was the key to it all. So resilience. The ones that succeeded were those that were resilient. They iterated, they learned, and they adapted. All right, so resilience is the key to getting through the scale journey. Incentives are the key to sustaining it. Scaling, to survive that transition from pilot to market is a very treacherous one. So they had to be responsive, innovative, and pivoting was the key. Pivot, pivot, pivot. So what allows people to pivot? Very quickly, these were the ones that we called successful. These were 7. They actually had their core model out to the target users. Oops. We did a collection of their extent to scale. We went back and we figured out what was their extent. You can look at this later, but each of these successful ones had, the message here is what we found was when those that succeeded at scale went very big. They went big or go home. So they either scaled wildly successfully or not at all. All right, let me move this thing because I can't read my own chart. So the secret sauce, the ability to pivot. So pivots came in multiple domino forms. First, there was pivots are all founded on faulty assumptions and strategy. I am going to emphasize that, and I'm going to go over a few minutes. I apologize in advance to Colin. But as an M&E person and a scaling person and a strategy person, those assumptions that you usually write in your strategy in very fine print and then you ignore until later, those were critical. Those were the make or break. I cannot emphasize that enough. So faulty assumptions, things like, I'm sure the government will take this up, did not hold true. Or our scale team has all the business skills that they need, not true. So a challenge would come up of a faulty assumption. They would have to pivot the business strategy, which would lead to a pivot in the scale approach, which would often lead to a pivot in the innovation model to some degree. So the key on the ability to pivot was you have to be able to detect your barriers to uptake. Feedback loops were critical. Those that succeeded had either local staff or locally experienced staff and a constant monitoring feedback loop with their target users and their partners. So when something went wrong, they knew and they knew why, and they pivoted quickly. They also had the authority to change. A few of these failed waiting for approval to change, either not necessarily from USAID, but from their own internal organizations. Another key thing on the ability to pivot was financing the transition. Here's the thing about a pivot, it's not what you planned by definition. So your original scale strategy with your work plan and your budget, this is not going to fit. So very often it's going to take definitely time and probably money to switch that strategy. So to switch your marketing approach, to switch partners, whatever you're going to do. And there was a couple of very similar grants that were almost identical. And the only reason why one became wildly successful and one did not was one was able to secure funding for the transition. Okay. Scaling strategy, basically what we found was the old prototypologies of public, private, and hybrid, that's losing its relevance. Most of them switched paths and approaches during their pilot, which should be expected because you're piloting something, you're testing it, so you might pivot. But these lines were very blurred. In this small sample of 12, private seemed to be the way to go. The scale approach, collaboration was the most common among the successful ones, but remember a lot of these were stage 1 and stage 2, so smaller. So it's very rare that an innovation team can do everything that's needed at large scale, including business functions. Outsourcing key business functions was a very successful strategy. Common business elements that were changed, distribution networks, customer financing was key, and bundling your product or service with others was also very successful. Key strategy assumptions that did not hold were about the capacities of the scaling team and the essential partners. I'm going to blitz through this. All right, let's see. Quick slide just on the domino effect of outsourcing. Outsourcing key business functions was extremely successful for a lot of the successful grants found here. And the upshot here is if you outsource your business functions, you can focus on your innovation and making it more effective and more tailored to users and put your energy there. So do what you do best, partner for the rest. And that usually frees up more of your resources to continue to do that. All right, partnerships, the secret sauce. Discernment was important. There was a lot of opaque, there's the innovators and then there's the investors. It's much more complex to that. This is a huge one. Shared commitment to social outcomes trumped financial every time. There were a couple of grants that had financial investors, but they still failed. So when things got rocky or things had to change, the investors pulled out. Now, those who were committed to the outcomes, helping farmers, stuck with it. These we can go through later, but users, one big surprise was that users and farmers needed flexible financing, and you had to tailor your invention to demand as well as need. I'll take one moment for this. A lot of the scale strategies, when you submit your application or you're doing your project, you have to outline the need. What's the problem you're solving? People are very good at that in development. However, they're not so good at looking at the demand, which is different than need. Do people need clean water? Yes. What's their demand around clean water? It's different. You've got to do your research on that. Evidence utility, what was the key here? One big surprise was that positive numbers did not guarantee an investment or uptake. There were 3 in this subsample that had very good performance numbers and income numbers, but did not scale. And others that had horrible numbers that did scale. And that gets back to, they had partners who were committed to that social outcome, who saw them through that transition. Longitudinal data of a few key measures, becomes your currency. Evidence that was missing, market research and user demand was the great big hole. Gender aspects were also very underrepresented. Evidence utility depended a lot, not so much on the rigor of the numbers or the database robustness, but commitment to the innovation success, fit to their data needs. Each partner is going to need a different type of data, whether it's revenue streams or potential target markets, and then the data robustness. For providers, investors, and financiers, we go through different types of evidence that we found common that they wanted. Financial viability, again, this is something that is a state for all essential stakeholders. And if you can't make your innovation financially viable from the users across the value chain to your investors, it's not going to scale, full stop. Financial sustainability, again, busting the Silicon Valley model of it's got to become profitable and have be self-sufficient by sales doesn't work anymore. A lot of very successful ones are living off of combined revenue, including grants, which for social innovations in emerging economies is critical. Otherwise, there's a reason why the big banks and the businesses haven't invested here. This is very high risk to make very little profit on very poor people. So it's never going to really fit that model. We have to be agnostic about revenue sources. Is this black bar in everybody's screen or just mine?
So
Okay, the financial viability elements I've listed out here, but basically what we told back to Div was if your scale team or grantee can reliably cover their expenses of the scaling process, we're going to call that viable. And we need to kind of bust up whether or not that is considered viable or not, both in the application and the support process. Business partners, financiers, these are the different types of viability elements we found. Key takeaways. I've got to move this thing. This is really in my way. So the scaling strategy, get rid of the old typologies, be flexible, plan for your pivots, and collaboration seems to work best for stages 1 and 2. For the model, commitment to constant improvement was key to broad and sustained uptake. A lot of the successful ones that continue to improve whatever their innovation was got more than their target users. They got other users, which created other income streams, which created, scalability and sustainability. Evidence. So RCTs don't always fit. Now, Michael Kremer, who is the king of RCTs, there's a video of him on YouTube from May of last year where he says that RCTs are really tough to do, especially in these contexts where you can't control all the elements. Out of these 12 grants, 7 had RCTs, only 1 was done very well and executed to its rigor. And of course, that was done by a Bioversity, a CG center, which is chock-a-block stocked with PhDs. But monitoring data proved to be essential here. And then we talked about the need and the fit of evidence and data to users. Here we go. What's the next one? Key takeaways. Partnerships, commitment trumps money as an asset every time. And every CEO and grantee that I spoke with hammered this point home. You have to find partners both who have assets to bring as well as financing who are committed to the same goal you are. And that is one of those is worth 10 bankers any day. Enablers or incentives have to be mapped out when you're doing your value chain mapping. That's also critical. Financial viability as a development industry, we need to be agnostic about revenue sources here, as long as they are reliable. And contextual elements, plan to be surprised. The best defense against the unexpected, which always comes, is diversity of partners, a good reputation, which you can also get with local partners on the ground. Local distribution channels and agents were found amazingly successful. Multiple income streams, if you don't have them, test them out and develop them. And emergency funds for that transition gap. Oh, and the last big finding was don't roller skate over age 50. That was key.
With that, Kate, and I guess all I can say is you're not going to be on roller skates again, I suppose. But Colin, over to you now.
Well, thank you. Let me try to share my screen. Oh, I think I have to. Okay, here we go.
Sorry, Colin, if I went over too much.
No, don't worry. First, can you guys see this?
Yes.
Awesome. No, Kate, it was fascinating. I love your work. I can't wait to read the final report. And I have a much easier job because you have to distill this tremendous amount of information. I get to just talk about one organization, ours. So I just have much less to try to fill in here. So, essentially what I'd like to do in my section here is to really explore how our work at One Acre Fund and specifically our evolving focus on climate adaptation, how it serves as a case study to really build on Kate's presentation, as well as the scaling principles that have come out of this community of practice. So there's really 2 big ideas that I want you guys to keep in mind as we sort of link back to what Kate's research found. So the first is that the world is complex. There's a lot of actors. And given that complexity, you really need adaptable organizations that can really respond to the incentives of their partners and clients. So in our case, that's really looking at how we understand the economic constraints of smallholder farmers and all the other business actors in the value chain, and how we figure out how to best serve them. And then the second point that I think, Kate, you so clearly illustrated was really the the value of flexible financing, right? That to be resilient, organizations need to think beyond this very limited binary of either being nonprofit or for-profit, grant-driven or revenue-driven. Ultimately, money is money, and if you can use your evidence, of social impact to bring in philanthropic money to close whatever gap you can't earn from earned revenue, why limit yourself if your goal is to really provide a service to very vulnerable, people, to populations that need it. So, just to very briefly explain what Acre Fund does for those that don't know. So we provide a bundled service to smallholder farmers. So we basically solve the key constraints that a farmer faces, the key market failings. So the first is we provide asset financing, primarily fertilizer and seed, but we bundle on other products as well because farmers, don't have cash at planting to afford the inputs on their own. Then we distribute these inputs into the very rural communities where we work because, again, none of this is news to people on this call, but if you're a smallholder farmer, you can't access high quality inputs or seeds in a very rural area. We provide weekly trainings to these farmers to make sure to help them maximize the return on investment. So teaching practices like microdosing fertilizer or, planting in rows that really make sure they're not losing money from the investment they're making. And then we do work around market facilitation. And so, we work like a business. And so we're charging for services and we're able to cover about 70% of our core business costs from what farmers pay us. And by listening to farmers, I think it really just allows us to refine this model as we continue to scale. And that path to scale is really reliant on a model that centers around field officers. So we have more than 6,000 full-time field officers. These are, full-time employees that are from the communities where we work. And they're really critical to delivering this bundle of services to both the individual farmers they work with and their families. And I think what's really important is that these FOs not only drive our program into the homes of farmers, but they also provide feedback that we need to adapt, to go back to that adaptability point. So in addition, basically to what we know about what farmers are willing to buy or not buy. So, cell phones are great where they actually have penetration. Precision agriculture is great despite the constraints of getting it to farmers. But I think this at the center of our effectiveness is this human to human connection between a farmer and a field officer. And this model has allowed us to scale from serving 60 farmers 15 years ago to serving almost 1.5 million farmers today. I think that if we think about, how do we know that what we're doing has value to farmers, we really invest a ton to come up with a very clean impact number. So not to get too much into the weeds here, but we basically, we create this very rigorous kind of impact profit number for farmers where we monetize their harvest. And we do that not by collecting self-reported data. We actually do tens of thousands of crop cuts to come up with a statistically significant sample of farmers where we actually know how much their harvest has been versus control farmers that are not in our program but have similar characteristics. So we're able to see, very, very concretely how much money a farmer is earning just from our service. So in this 3-year period, that was, over $100 of value. And I think what's really important here is, impact really then serves as a currency for us. It's an internal currency that helps us make decisions because so much of our money is then restricted because we have, so much of it is farmer revenue. We make investment decisions on countries to invest in or even products to invest in based on what has the most impact. Because, obviously you can disaggregate out this number in all sorts of ways. But I think even more interestingly for this conversation, it's a currency in our external conversations. As we look to talk to donors to fill that gap in revenue, the currency becomes what's valuable. And to Kate's point, I mean, if you can prove to philanthropic donors that you have a rigorous impact, we have found you can sustainably, build resources from that income stream. So, just to pivot to the adaptation side of this, none of this is news to you. Climate change is obviously making all of this economics much more difficult. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how, as you look at the crop yields decreasing over the coming decades and poverty rates increasing, how the economic lives of farmers are difficult. And it's increasingly difficult for farmers to make the long-term investments necessary to adapt versus I think what we've leveraged, which is their short-term willingness to buy fertilizer and seed for maize that they're going to eat in the subsequent season. Those long-term investments are much harder to get them to focus on just because they're long-term. And farmers are obviously, they have to be conservative in what they spend money on. So to do that, what we're doing is layering on a number of adaptation interventions on top of our core model. And I think a key part of this is, this is something that we've done organically. We haven't like centrally planned this through some sort of a conversation with donors in a conference center somewhere. This is something that we've adapted on the ground as we've gotten feedback from farmers. I mean, going back years as we started seeing the effects of changing weather patterns. So the first is that for a long time now, we've been one of the largest providers of crop insurance in Africa. So we cover all our farmers with insurance. It's actually just input insurance. We can't afford to cover any sort of loss of yields. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but we are able to forgive loans if there is a weather failing. The second is, how do we help farmers make the optimized seed choices for their specific farm? And there's a lot of interesting work around how to do that and how to create the right distribution network to then get them those seeds. We've invested a ton into improving soil health. So, years ago, we added composting to our trainings. We've added lime to our package to reduce soil acidity. And there's a lot of stuff we're doing to try to basically build healthier soils that are going to be absolutely critical to empower farmers to weather climate change. No pun intended. And then finally, we've invested a lot into intercropping and helping farmers diversify away from just maize. And there's, we have a big agroforestry program. We're investing a lot in fruit trees. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about, some of the kind of the financial constraints based on that lived reality of smallholders that make that difficult. But before I do that, I just want to flag the issues we see in the broader ecosystem around financing adaptation. So, I think our core model has really shown the value of providing credit and distribution of inputs to drive up staple crop yields. And like I said, it allows us to cover 70% of our costs from earned revenue. But farmers are just much less able to pay for adaptation, given that long-term payoff. And I think the reality is adaptation is expensive. It's also hard to measure, which makes, I think, a lot of donors, nervous about how to approach it. And I think, unfortunately, if you look at like the recent climate discussions, let's say at COP26, we're just very worried that there's very little resources being directed to smallholder farmers. EFAD actually came out with an analysis in 2020 showing that only 1.7% of climate financing actually benefited smallholder farmers in any way. And if you look at the 2 weeks of COP26, there was nothing around, food systems or farmers. So I think there's just a really big gap globally in how we think about financing climate adaptation for smallholders. And so what we want to provide are kind of investable paths where that sort of philanthropic money can be built on top of an infrastructure that is already sustainable through all these multiple sources of revenue we have, but that really does help show a smallholder farmer the value of that investment. And so to do that, I just wanted to flag three investment paths where we really think that, smart subsidy can really be catalytic. Subsidy, it shouldn't be a scary word. It should be seen as something that can be catalytic to this long-term change. So the first is connecting smallholders into carbon markets, especially through agroforestry. So we see on-farm agroforestry as a particularly impactful adaptation intervention. Our goal is actually to support the cumulative planting of 1 billion trees in the next decade through our farmer network. And so we've been looking for a while for sustainable financing paths to reach that goal because, farmers have limited ability to pay directly for trees, given that their payoff is 10 years after you plant it. And so we think we hope we might have found one through carbon markets. And we're currently undertaking 5 pilots of different models to tap into carbon markets. So for example, in Zambia, we're partnering with Rabobank to basically compensate farmers to keep trees in the ground in the long term. And so that necessitates grant funding at the beginning of that cycle. But then eventually we're hoping we can shift the payments to facilitated carbon payments. The second, and we have several more pilots that I'm happy to explore if people have questions. The second path is crop diversification. So I mentioned how important crop diversification is for us, but it's really hard. Like, it's really hard to convince farmers to shift away from maize, which they know and they trust. And so to get them to move to more climate resilient crops, you sort of have to prove the value for them. And I think we found grant money can really help to begin that process. So for example, we're partnering with USAID in Malawi through a program through Palladium to source high quality groundnut seeds that are actually grown and developed through the Peanut Center, which is a really, one of Feed the Future's, big investments in sort of the research chain. That's really helped us to begin to kind of prove the value of groundnuts to smallholders. And we're in discussions now to further scale that work. And then finally, we need to democratize access to precision agriculture technology. So, high-income farmers are increasingly reliant on sort of the precise information precision agriculture technology can give them. And this is going to be critical to help them tailor their planting practices and their input decisions to the unique conditions of their fields. And, as weather patterns change, that need to be efficient just increases. But precision agriculture generally just doesn't reach smallholder farmers. Not only do smallholders not have smartphones, but we find with our farmers, even simple tools like USSD menus, which are like drop-down menus on an old dumb phone, still need some field officer helping the farmer to navigate that, just because digital literacy is so low. And that's especially true for women farmers. So 60% of our farmers are women, but they're particularly excluded from technology and need particular help on things like digital literacy. And so there's a lot of work we're doing that I'm happy to explore that's trying to plug this gap. So,
minutes, Colin.
Yep, I'm done. This is my last slide. And really, this is more of a slide to hand back to you, Mark, because, I think what I was hoping to just explore here are some of the ways that we're trying to kind of adapt to the changing ecosystem and building on the principles Kate mentioned. But I'm really interested in addition to answering any questions people have and hearing about other types of organizational models that are making similar adaptations to climate change, and that are similarly looking to mix revenue in creative ways. So I will stop sharing there, and that's it. There was a lot very quick.
It was a lot. Thank you very much. Both presentations had an awful lot of information. I guess I will use my prerogative as a MC to ask a couple questions, one of each of you. The first question, Colin, just you mentioned you're up to 1.5 million farmers in 15 years. Well, what's the churn rate of those farmers? And then for Kate, you didn't discuss market intermediaries and their role so much as far as they appeared in the evaluation. If you could speak to the role of market intermediaries, that'd be at least interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge distribution across all of our countries. And this is not a precise number, so don't quote me on this without confirming, but I would say about 60 to 70% of our farmers re-enroll season to season, right? And what we often find is farmers will re-enroll one season, they'll take a break, they'll come back. We also find farmers don't work with us on all of their fields, so they'll work with us maybe on half an acre. They'll buy inputs for half an acre, and then they'll just go and figure out other ways of working with the rest of their field, because obviously there's constraints to working within our system. So I think that it's a fairly dynamic situation with farmers coming in and out and finding the right way for them to work with us.
Thank you. Kate?
Sorry, here I am. Hi. Yeah, so market intermediaries were huge. And again, there's a whole part of the framework in terms of partnerships and lenses I would love to unpack perhaps at a later date. But the intermediaries that became so critical were, in this case, because we're talking about digital ag, were the agro dealers writ large. So the traditional local agents who supply to farmers and then up the chain a bit, but also including other INGOs. So Mercy Corps, Save the Children, INGOs that have long-term established programs that are locally staffed in these target areas, a lot of huge successful strategy was when some of these grant teams outsourced a lot of the awareness raising and distribution and bundling to these other partners. So market intermediaries were absolutely critical. So it was part of the do what you do best, outsource for the rest. A lot of other elements were being known and trusted is key, and leveraging existing market intermediaries was critical. A lot of these grants are, 1, 2, 3 years, maybe. Most of them are about 2 years. And you don't have time, as any business person can tell you, to build up a brand and all that. If you can go through local channels that people know that dealer or that educator or that NGO, and your innovation is kind of bundled in there, that saves you so much time and money and trust, which was key. So they were big.
All right, thank you. So I'm looking at the chat. We've got a few questions, which I would like to ask you to address. So this one's targeted to you, Kate. It's from Katie Hauser, saying that the secret sauce. So what's the takeaways for donors seeking to facilitate scale? Was it just the DIV funding that enabled successful business to, oh my, I lost my chat.
I took over your screen.
Yeah.
Was it able? Yeah. No, I saw that comment.
Okay, so was it just the DIV funding that enabled successful business to pivot? They already had the business acumen to do so?
No, so no on both accounts. So now DIV did give additional funding to a lot of the grantees who requested it. So they were very helpful with this transition gap funding, but not always. And again, some of them that were, we had 2 ISOCO style innovations funded here that were almost identical, but number one, cut and paste doesn't work. But number 2, the reason that one succeeded so well, went gangbusters, and the other one didn't, was they found partners who not only kind of covered their operating costs during the transition, but did things like, you need an accountant, let me give you one of my staff in kind, he'll work for you for 9 months while you're doing this, and that kind of stuff. So it wasn't just the donors. And this is another key to what we found in success, was the ability to diversify and be agnostic about your income. So I just whipped this slide up very quickly of this is kind of a quick take on the recommendations to the donors. And again, these haven't been endorsed yet, but if you were going to do it again after this analysis, screening for evidence, DIV and a lot of these programs ask for evidence of your innovation. And a lot of grantees have wonderful evidence on the effectiveness of their innovation. Does the water pump work? And that's great. But a huge missing part and a key to a reason why a lot of these failed was they didn't have market research about what was out there and then demand for the users. Value chain partners, multiple revenue streams. This is something that I would look for. Do they have multiple revenue streams? Is there a potential for this innovation to generate multiple revenue streams, whether it's the government subsidizing part of it and non-target users using it and paying for it, and therefore the others can have it for free? Support for the pivots, be flexible in your strategies, things like that. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Kate.
I hope I answered that question.
Yes, I think you did. So, Colin, to you, Johannes has a question. How sustainable are 1 acre fund programs beyond the limited years of grant financing available?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Johannes, because I do think that gets at the crux of kind of what I was trying to say. And I think maybe the first thing to say is just, we definitely know that smallholder farmers can be reliable customers. So pre-COVID, COVID's been a little tough, but historically and going forward, we get 98 to 99% repayment, right? And that's for market prices like this. Like a farmer is not paying a subsidized price for our services. They're paying market price for fertilizer and seed. We bundle in the costs of training and distribution, and they repay. So I think that's the first point to make. But the second point to make is, if we didn't care about the poverty levels and the vulnerability levels of our farmers, we could break even and maybe even make a profit now. And we have sites in Kenya that have broken even. But I think if you actually want to serve the most poor, the most vulnerable farmers, of which there are many, so our entire Burundi program, which serves 100,000 farmers as an example, I think that's where you have to start thinking, okay, like, how do I bring in other revenue? And I think the reality is for the not even the poorest of the poor, but just like the non-wealthy farmers, you're never going to make money off of them. I think we have a somewhat of a fallacy in the way we think about development, that there's like going to be, and this is Kate, you got to this really eloquently in your presentation, that we're going to get to some private sector solution where people can make money serving a farmer that has half an acre of land in Burundi. Like, it's just not going to happen. So I think like this, back to my impact as currency bit, my hope is we have shown that you can actually sustainably bring in philanthropic revenue to cover that shortfall if you can prove that you are having an impact. There is no shortage of money in this world. There is a lot of money, and there are a lot of very rich people that don't know what to do with their money. So if you can prove to them using a very clear metric that you're serving those low-income populations, I actually think our story shows that you can sustainably bring in philanthropic financing to help you, meet that particular goal, while you generate revenue from farmers that, maybe even break even with farmers that can pay. So I just think that's, to me, such an important point in all of our work is there really is no shortage of money in this world. It's just, how are you bringing it into your organization? And how do you think a little bit more creatively about diverse revenue streams to get there, rather than thinking the only path is to become profitable?
Do you mind, Mark, can I add just one sentence to that? Oh, I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would add to that. So yeah, I mean, what, not only in this assessment, but in a couple of other global assessments I've done in the past year, what we found with, in terms of scaling and sustainability, is that funding across for different pieces of whatever you're scaling also became a successful recipe. So the profits and the income streams that you're going to get from your target users, if they're poor, is going to be minimal. From other users, you may be able to get more, and some are successful that way, like, having additional functions on an app that, governments can pay for. But having donors or philanthropists or grant funding pay just to cover operations was one key way of doing that. And then you kind of tranche out your operational costs. You want to be able to have your dealers and your distribution partners making commission or profits off of that. So you it's a divide and conquer kind of thing with your revenue streams. We have found that to be a successful model, instead of trying to get one source of funding to cover everything.
All right, thank you, Kate and Colin. So Colin, there's another question here from Andrew Carlin. Have you ever tried to measure the impact of farmer engagement with 1 Acre Fund on their non-1 Acre Fund farming practices?
I have a very quick, and it won't be a satisfying answer, Andrew. I think we have. I don't actually know the details. I know we've done 2 RCTs to like validate our core impact number, and I'm pretty sure we looked at a number of spillover questions, including maybe within farmer groups. So I'm very happy if you want to send me a follow-up email to track down more on what that looks like from our M&E team. But apologies, I don't have a better answer.
I will add that farmer engagement was found to be a very successful strategy, that those that succeeded at scaling were the ones that had formal, planned, frequent engagements with their target users on design, testing, iterating, redesign. This was, it's a pilot, learn something, test. So that was structured engagement was critical success for a lot of these.
Hey, thank you. And I saw this really interesting question from Brian Hilton, and it'll be interesting to hear how you answer it. So doesn't scaling mean an activity that has attained critical mass and can go forward on its own without continued support? So I guess, Colin, how do you?
I'm just going to be a broken record on this again and say, I think it has to continue with revenue. And I just think we should be agnostic on where the revenue comes from. I mean, look, if we're saying it's scaled by a government, that's public money. It's just tax money that's scaling it, right? If a philanthropic organization, a social enterprise can tap into that same pool of public money, I don't see how that's any less viable as a scaling strategy from a government. I mean, like I said, we're serving 1.5 million farmers, right? We have more touch points with farmers than most governments. And if we're able to tap into public money to do that, it feels to me that is viable equally to a tax base that funds that. So I think it's a good question. And I think you're right. I think we have a sense of scaling that really thinks it has to. And I know, Larry, we've had a lot of good conversations about this, Larry. So, you know, I recognize that I'm not trying to be too heretical here, but I guess I just don't buy that there's a binary between that it's only government or private. Like, I just think it's a much wider continuum. And to my impact as currency bit, because I think that's critical, I think the key is you have to be able to prove your value, whether you're a government proving the value of a process through some democratic process that's allowing you to commit a budget line to it, or you're a company proving a revenue stream, or you're us, you know, proving to a high net worth individual to fund it. I just think at the end of the day, like, you have to show that you're providing value. So I don't know, I maybe that's unsatisfying, but I guess I feel kind of strongly about that point.
If I may add, this is also kind of a bit of an antiquated assumption of development that I would also like to bust down as the myth. Now, donors, of course, you know, don't want to be funding something in perpetuity. That's not the point. The point is to, you know, invest and catalyze and support. And yet, again, in a lot of the studies I've done, not just this one, but others over the last couple of years, looking at global programs and what is sustained and what works, is that not only for USAID, but all donors, there is a part of social innovations for emerging economies and poor people that is never going to be sustained by the private sector ever. It's just not. It's contradictory on principle. So there is a long-term role for donor or philanthropic funding for these very early testing seed social innovations. Now, at some point, that doesn't mean the donor has to keep funding the same thing forever. No. But do donors as a whole have to keep funding that scaling process and testing? Yes. And then again, as Colin said, it's not binary anymore. Private, by definition, means anything that's not government, but it doesn't mean for profit. There's a lot of CBOs, NGOs, there's a lot of other networks and organizations that can provide support and funding that are not for profit, but they are technically private. So I think, again, we need to broaden our horizons about this is not just about making a profit from the sale of something to private individuals. There's a lot of other ways to fund social innovations. And again, remembering if the goal here is, you know, food security and getting out of poverty and not profit. Profit can help along the way, but it should be the means and not the goal.
Can I, yeah, I love that point, Kate. Mark, can I say a very quick response to Johannes's follow-up comment? And Johannes, I wish you, there's so many ways that we should just continue this conversation because I realize it's complicated. I did just want to say on your point, Johannes, about the, you know, basically the need to mobilize political support. You're right, like that's a risk for One Acre Fund. Can we continue to mobilize the support among our donor base to continue with the philanthropic money? Larry, we've talked about that. I would say a government has the same risk. Can they maintain the political support to keep funding a social program? Can a company continue maintaining the business case to build in revenue? I guess I just feel at some point there is always uncertainty about the future when it comes to revenue. And I think the key point is, do you have a strong business model in whichever stream you're going for that can either build the political support or the philanthropic support, the revenue kind of support? Are you making that case for the long term? I just think that's a risk everyone faces.
And just one very quick example, one of the cases we looked at was a very strong business model, had fantastic numbers, got Series A funding, a lot of it, and at the last moment, that funding was pulled and the whole thing went down. So again, nothing is secure. Private money and investors is not the brass ring. It doesn't mean it can't, it's not volatile, it is.
So I'm sorry I have to cut this great conversation off. I think many of us would like to continue it. However, Leonard has asked for a minute or so to wrap up. So Leonard, over to you.
No, thank you. I just really wanted to say thank you to all of you, Mark, for your excellent facilitation, and Kate and Colin for, well, excellent presentations and comments and discussion. And really thank you for all the fantastic questions. We're going to